right, so we're here in Phoenix with Guillermo Jasson from Argentina, and you're living in the States now.
Correct.
Guillermo is on our crash panel talking about the different countries that have experienced hyperinflation in our relatively recent history, and just thought we'd catch up for a few minutes and see if there's something that our viewers can learn from your experience and from the experience of the people in Argentina. So I guess in the beginning, how did it begin? What went wrong in Argentina?
It's Argentina's history. It's a little bit of a tumultuous, if you want, a series of episodic crises every 5 years that go back, 100 years or so. If we go to the later stages of the situation, I think you could start off in the 80s, 89, that period of time, where there was hyperinflation. There was inflation was the enemy, and the standard that everybody measured themselves against was the dollar. So it was a very serious effort by the government to fight that, and they did tax reform, privatizations, deregulation, and they came up with a currency board, and they pegged the dollar to the peso 1-to-1, and you could not print a peso unless you had a dollar in reserve. So it was a very good and serious effort. As time went on, obviously things were not working exactly the way they should have, and the currency wasn't truly floating. And there came a point where there was a little bit of denial, accepting the fact that that currency board needed to be changed, and that the convertibility law couldn't sustain itself. The denial was strong enough that there was a time when there should have been a 30% devaluation. The market realized that things weren't right. They couldn't issue debt as they used to, and by the time that they wanted to do something about it, they started doing first the swap, and then they realized they just could not do it, so they ended up devaluating, defaulting. The currency jumped to 2-to-1 as opposed to 1.3. That would have been maybe adequate at the time, and then to 3, and it never came back. Right. So it was a story of denial, amongst other things, with a very bad track record.
So how bad did it get at the peak of the inflation?
The peak of inflation was probably between 2,500 and 3,000 per year. That was the hyperinflation time. Right. This new plan got inflation under control, and they were heroes for that. Right. After the devaluation and the default, inflation became less of an issue because the population couldn't afford it. So there was a natural, if you want, protection against it, because it was just unsustainable. The problem was that people lost their assets. The banks froze the deposits. You couldn't access your money if you had it, and the country just was in complete disarray.
So it was the post-inflation where was the real problems.
It was the lack of adjustment to the solution that was used to bring hyperinflation down wasn't the best solution to keep going, and there was I think a little bit of a lack of velocity in responding to that change.
I remember a friend of mine in Buenos Aires was saying that there was no money on the street. You couldn't find coins to pay for the newspaper, and that the people who had credit cards, of all things, were actually okay, but the people that didn't have access to money or to small cash, any kind of cash, were in big trouble.
Absolutely. I think because of the history of crisis in Argentina, and situations like this having happened, not to the same degree of duress before, a lot of people who were able to had their money outside of the country. A lot of them had some money at home, but most of the people had the money in the banks. And at the time, you could have a dollar account or a peso account. Although the dollar wasn't an official currency, it was accepted everywhere. You could take a cab and pay with the dollars and so on and so forth. When there was a run on deposits, they passed a decree and they said you cannot take more than 1,000 pesos per month. And essentially what that did is, as you were very well describing, you would have access to your money through a credit card, but you wouldn't otherwise. And you have to remember that in Argentina, the bancarization level isn't that high, so not everybody had a bank account, but those who had a bank account didn't necessarily have a credit card as well. Right. So the situation became really very strenuous, and people knew that they were losing, their savings and their future at a very fast pace as the currency continued to devaluate, and they could do nothing about it.
So just so I've got this straight, there was an initial inflation. Then they brought in the currency board. But before the the currency board, when you had inflation running at 2,500% a year, that obviously, this was a money printing, this was a monetary phenomenon?
Yes, and there was a psychological side to things that, by definition, notwithstanding what, the fundamentals dictated, people just lost completely the confidence in the currency. So you would get your salaries in pesos paid, and you would leave the office and go running to get dollars. Because if you did that a day later, you knew you had lost maybe, 10%. So all of a sudden, the dynamic was just so dramatically out of control that the hyperinflation was just, leaving with no way to control it.
Right. So in the case of Yugoslavia, I heard from Milos, they when they brought in the convertibility, when they made the dinar, they devalued and made it convertible to Deutschmark. That ended the crisis there. But in the case of Argentina, it ended the inflation initially, but then it caused a different crisis.
Correct. We had 10 very good years of stability, growth, prosperity, and people really thought that that was a change for good. And because there was such a stigma psychologically with inflation, they felt that if they were to devalue, and there was a little bit of, recognition that inflation was a factor and so on and so forth, it would very quickly spiral back into hyperinflation. And I believe that's maybe one of the reasons why the government went into denial, and eventually, obviously, things just didn't work out.
Right. Well, I know in the German hyperinflation there was sort of two periods. There was a period of the hyperinflation, and then there was a brief period where there was actually a decent economic boom, and then the whole thing blew up again, and ultimately ended up with Hitler and so on.
And we know the rest of that story.
We know the rest of that story. But so the consequences of the initial inflation were fairly long-lasting, although again there was this period of some tranquility and growth, and then the second crisis came around. How did the second crisis end?
It ended up with a series. First of all, it was following the devaluation and lots of political changes. Like several presidents lasting between weeks and months. The country little by little started to realize that they were going to stay with an exchange rate that was probably the 3-to-1 level. Eventually, it dragged out to 4-to-1, which is what we have today. And from that perspective, that started to stabilize. And then people started to realize that, that wasn't going anywhere. And there wasn't inflation because it was unaffordable for the population. And little by little, things started to, fall a little bit into back into place. And they realized that they were incredibly inexpensive in terms of, production cost. There was a lot of spare capacity. And they realized that they could start, exporting a few things. And obviously there are commodities and things that have always been very strong and good for the country. The degree of debt with the debt restructuring that followed was significant. There was an enormous haircut. And therefore, the government all of a sudden had a healthier balance sheet. China came out with, industrialization and the commodity boom that, truly helped, the fundamentals of, the economy in Argentina. And little by little, the population started to get that, and they moved into years of, significant growth. So there were 3 or 4 years that followed with 7 to 9% growth. That
because
was
Argentina has something to sell. It has a way to grow because of its commodity base and.
Argentina got a second chance. Where decades ago you would send tons of soy and get a microprocessor back. Now commodities are really valuable, and all of a sudden, all of the things that the country is able to produce and export, I think gave them an opportunity to grow, and that's what saved the country.
But now they're back into inflation, which is, depending on who you listen to, is running somewhere between 12 and 25%.
I think, unfortunately, the government, estimates are a little bit, difficult to reconcile with what you see in the markets. And inflation is certainly an issue, and the growth is still there, but the constraint today is that the international investors have been punished through this crisis enough that they don't see clear rules for investment, and therefore there's been very little investment in infrastructure. Everything that was a regulated business and had tariffs and was computed for inflation and thinking about the affordability of the population was frozen in terms of tariffs, and therefore no investment came in. And the growth today is constrained by the lack of infrastructure to support it.
Were you able to buy gold in Argentina? Did people buy gold in Argentina?
I don't think there was a major sort of a thought process that said that's what we need to do. I think people were looking at the dollar as if it was gold. So there were thousands of ways to get dollars. I don't think, the mentality of the normal person nor the more sophisticated individuals there was pointing to gold at the time.
Yeah, this brings up a very interesting point, because what the Argentine experience, what the Yugoslavia experience, and the Zimbabwe experience, in all those cases, the answer has been almost exactly the same, which is sort of have to think about it. Gold. And anybody no, but they would go for alternative currencies. In the case of Yugoslavia, it was the Deutschmark. In the case of Argentina, it was the dollar. So that was the reserve currency to a certain extent. This was the hard currency.
Exactly. I think the hard currency is I think the critical term.
So what happens if the dollar is eroding badly? Is it just a matter of relativity? I mean, let's say it happened again and inflation in Argentina started running quite fast, but the dollar was eroding less. So is the dollar still going to be the preferred?
I think it is still probably a very dollar-based mentality. A lot of people are probably starting to realize that the dollar may not be what it was in the past, and from that perspective, I wouldn't be a good judge of describing what people are doing today, but I would imagine that a lot of people are diversifying away from the dollar also.
Right. Very interesting. All right. Well, good. This has been fine, and appreciate you being here. And
thanks for having me. It's been a great experience, and it's a great conference. Congratulations.
That's good. Thanks.